Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero.
How heroic he comes from.
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
All right, welcome back to the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I am your host, Kevin. This week, there's really two big things in the news. The first thing is the government shutdown has ended. There's a lot of reasons that have been given as to why exactly Donald Trump decided to cave and accept the proposal that the Democrats had given over a month ago. But some of them, people have said it was the Nancy Pelosi standing up and saying he wouldn't be able to do the State of the Union in the Congressional House. But I think it's pretty obvious to anybody who is really paying attention that the shutdown happens to end the day that flights start getting delayed at one of America's biggest airports, LaGuardia. Air traffic controllers as well as TSA and border security were all working without pay this entire time. So that's a month, 2 paychecks without actually getting paid. And it was starting to affect the ability for air traffic controllers to do their job. And when they stopped being able to show up or were doing sick-outs and what essentially amount to wildcat strikes, all of a sudden we saw the end of the shutdown. So there was a call by the air traffic controller union's president that essentially calling a potential general strike if the shutdown were to continue. And so the fact that that call went out and, a few days later it ended, I think gives actually the lesson that we need to learn from the shutdown. It's not so much that, you stick to your guns or something like that. It's that when push comes to shove, workers get together and they change things. So that's a big thing in the news, except for what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about everyone's favorite issue of socialism, Venezuela. All right, so obviously the reason I wanted to talk about Venezuela this week is because it's been in the news. It's been a pretty prominent thing in the news, actually, especially in the recent days, because last week on the 23rd, which is the anniversary of the 1958 uprising that overthrew the military dictatorship in Venezuela, the National Assembly president, which is basically stacked with the opposition, Juan Guaido, gave a speech to a crowd during a mass opposition rally against President Maduro, in which he declared himself the country's
asumir formalmente las competencias del Ejecutivo Nacional como el presidente encargado de Venezuela.
Venezuela's been in the news, obviously, for years, basically for 20 years, as long as I can remember. And I remember in 1999 when things really changed, and it was a big moment for me being a younger kid and seeing what I thought was going to be a big leftward turn in Latin America that really did turn out to be. But there's a huge amount of misinformation and disinformation when it comes to Venezuela. And so I think in order to kind of give a full picture of the way that I think about it, one, I did do a response to David Peckman's Why I'm Not a Socialist, in which he uses Venezuela as a model for socialism, because I don't think that Venezuela is a model for socialism. I actually think that Venezuela is a model for social democracy. So I think it's important to get a bit of a background on Venezuela so that we can see kind of where and how we've gotten to where we are with it. And so the history of modern Venezuela, obviously we have indigenous movement into the area from Asia to the Bering Land Bridge, and then all the way down into Latin America and the Spanish discovery, Spanish colonial period, the independence movement in the early 19th century led by Simon Bolivar. Originally, Venezuela is part of the larger Gran Colombia. Then it becomes independent, and like many other Latin American countries, was led back and forth by military juntas and sort of pro-democracy leaders, all basically throughout the 20th century. There were many economic crises and issues with basically larger macroeconomic problems that caused the inability to develop in the way that Venezuela could have, though there is this notion that there was sort of an old heyday of when Venezuela was really good. But one thing that Venezuela did have different than a lot of its other neighbors in Latin America was a considerable amount of oil and one of the world's largest oil reserves, which gave it a particularly good commodity, especially when oil prices were rising, in order for it to have large exports and increase the government coffers. Many of this was usually to ingratiate the certain upper class of Venezuela, and by the end of the 20th century, essentially, there was a huge collapse in confidence in all of the existing parties. They were all either neoliberal or very conservative parties, and in the malaise that was going on, a coup attempt, led by a young colonel, I believe, named Hugo Chavez, actually failed, and he eventually called it off, spent some time in prison, but was released, and in the late 1990s ran a campaign on essentially for a Bolivarian revolution after Simon Bolivar, which was 21st century socialism as Hugo Chavez outlined it. And so Chavez was an amazing character. He had the charisma, which is very seldom seen, I think, in the world, and was able to galvanize an entire generation of people in Venezuela. And the Chavista movement that is still going on in Venezuela, it very much owes itself to the particular charisma of Hugo Chavez, but actually of a man who stepped into a moment and took advantage of an amazing opportunity and did actually a lot of good. We hear a lot of bad things about Venezuela, but what we don't hear is about all the good that was done during this Bolivarian revolution, particularly in the first 10 years. Venezuela engaged in a project of helping out the poorest. The Bolivarian revolution for the poor in Venezuela include the missions. Mission Robinson about literacy, Mission Barrio Adentro for free medical coverage, Mission Mercal, affordable food. The missions worked. Extreme poverty fell from 20.2% in 1999 to 7.6% in 2008. Household poverty fell from 49% in 1999 to 26.4% in 2009. Between 1988 and 1998, social spending in Venezuela averaged 9.5% of the GDP, but during the missions, it increased to 17.5%. By 2008, Venezuela's investment in health was 18.8% of GDP, and its enrollment in higher education exploded by 338%, going from less than 700,000 to over 2 million people. So what you essentially have is a massive, massive public investment being carried out by the use of oil revenues in a period of time when oil revenues were going through the roof. Chavez was also vocal against the United States, seeing it as the Yankee imperialist, taking on the rhetoric of Cuban revolutionaries like Che Guevara. In April 2002, with help from the CIA, anti-government forces briefly ousted Chavez from power. Supposedly based on pressure following popular demonstration by opponents of Chavez, the opposite turned out to be true. And when they actually did the coup attempt, hundreds of thousands of millions of Venezuelans poured into the streets in Caracas and other places, demanding the return of Hugo Chavez. However, that was not the end of economic and social campaigns against Chavez, always with support and assistance from the United States. Whether it be Bush or Obama, the United States has always maintained a hostile position regarding the Bolivarian Republic.
I think that the first people who should read this
These campaigns have also included all-out national strikes that lasted from December 2002 to February 2003, including a strike and lockout at the state oil company, which produced severe economic dislocation, and the country's GDP dropped by 27%, costing the oil industry over $10 billion. While previously Venezuela had used its oil reserves to help out Cuba and other places around Latin America, throughout the 2000s, decline in oil prices due to the discovery and extraction of the shale oil in the United States and Canada led to significant economic problems in Venezuela. In that decade, the government was forced to do several currency devaluations. Those obviously did little to improve the situation of regular Venezuelans. At the same time, the government stayed committed to its Bolivarian mission and continued to spend on its social projects. Chavez survived several further political tests. In 2004, a recall referendum attempted to oust him from power, but he was roundly re-elected. He was elected again for another term in 2006 and re-elected in October 2012. He was never sworn in for that third term because he had medical complications.
A las 4:25 de la tarde de hoy 5 de marzo ha fallecido el comandante presidente Hugo Chávez Frías. Luego
On March 5, 2013, after a nearly 2-year fight with cancer, Hugo Chavez died in Cuba. The presidential election that took place on Sunday, April 14, 2013, was the first since Chavez took office in 1989 in which his name did not appear on the ballot. Instead, it'd be his former vice president, the much less charismatic Nicolas Maduro. Due to the worsening economic situation in Venezuela and the continued U.S.-led campaign against it, which included capital freezes and trade withdrawals, poverty and inflation began to increase. Chavez had picked Maduro as his successor and appointed him vice president in 2013 before he died. He was elected president following Chavez's death, which is the first times that we heard claims of manipulation of an election in Venezuela. Former President Jimmy Carter had numerous times praised Venezuela's electoral system as being the freest and fairest in the world. Despite winning a fair election, opposition leaders and international media began immediately calling the government of Maduro a dictatorship. From 2014 on, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have protested over high levels of criminal violence, corruption, hyperinflation, and the chronic scarcity of basic goods, which was a result of the deteriorating economic situation. Much of the blame has always been put on the government for this problem, and it's not totally false to say that the government could have made a bunch of different decisions. But put yourself in the position of Venezuela. You have an immense amount of oil reserves, oil prices are high, and you have a population that desperately needs social spending. You decide to do the good social democratic thing and use the national resources of the country to help out the worst members of society. Now, you do that assuming, with good reason, that the prices will not dip incredibly and that the entire economy of the world will not collapse. Now, perhaps that's naivete, and that's probably true. But when you're a country with one major export, and that export is helping you create a better society, it makes a lot of sense to use that, and use it now, rather than to save it for when the economy of the world destroys your country's economy. Add to that the fact that there are these campaigns against Venezuela, the inability to trade like a normal country does, simply because of the foreign policy positions that Chavez and Maduro have taken, namely being against the United States. Does this warrant the inability to engage in world economic affairs on a level playing field or a fair playing field as, say, Colombia or Ecuador? I don't understand why Venezuela is looked at as something different. Unless, of course, you look at its position to the United States, which, unlike Ecuador and unlike Colombia, do not take that position, but instead do America's bidding. When Donald Trump got elected, he made it clear that even the military option is on the table when it comes to Venezuela. And he added fuel to the fire when he imposed economic sanctions in 2017. After each one of these crises, the situation did calm down, and it didn't necessitate the kind of heavy-handed violence that you would see in something you'd call a dictatorship. By August of 2016, the momentum to recall President Maduro was progressing pretty well. The National Electoral Council set a date for October. In October, the CNE suspended the referendum days before the signature gatherings were to be held. The reason for it was they found irregularities and voter fraud. And given the widespread nature of it, they canceled the referendum. As a result, of course, we hear more dictatorship talk. Days after the recall movement was canceled, 1.2 million Venezuelans protested throughout the country and demanded that President Maduro leave office. At the same time, millions of others rallied for President Maduro, so it's really hard to tell which ones have the greater amount of support. Most of the protests in Caracas around at that time were pretty calm, but there were clashes in other parts of the country, and it left over 120 people injured and 147 arrested. In November, talks with National Assembly President and opposition leader Henry Romasalup, led by the Vatican, eventually broke down and the Vatican pulled out. This led to further protests, and though they were becoming less intense, and they continued to die down after President Maduro called for a controversial special election, which would elect the Constituent National Assembly, the purpose of that being to rewrite the Constitution. Regional elections occurred for that, but many boycotted the election because they saw it as basically attempting to create a different National Assembly that would be packed with the president's supporters. After the NCE was seated, the government announced that elections were to be moved ahead to February or March 2018, when they were originally planned for late 2018. In December 2017, President Maduro announced that the main opposition parties, including Justice First and Popular Will, were banned from participating in the 2018 election. Basically because they boycotted the 2017 elections and because of their ongoing campaign against Maduro, which included an attempt on his life. Maduro won the 2018 election with 67.8% of the vote. Not exactly the vote you see in a dictatorship. However, the result was deemed fraudulent and denounced by countries like Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, Canada, and of course the United States. Other countries such as Cuba, China, Russia, Turkey, Mexico, and Iran came out in support of Maduro as president, and Russia described the U.S. support for National Assembly leader Guaido as a quasi-coup. China said it supported the Venezuelan government effort to preserve the country's sovereignty, independence, and stability. On January 10th, Maduro was finally inaugurated for his term. It was just 13 days later when Guaido made his declaration of the being interim president. He supposedly did this based on a provision in the Venezuelan constitution that says if the president is unable to serve the term, then the president of the National Assembly can actually take the powers that Guaido has taken. However, the things that would disallow the president from actually being the president are things like mental or physical incapacity, which is not the case for Maduro. So the grounds by which Guaido has basically assumed the position of interim president is not legal. And any country who is supporting his ability to do that is in violation of international law. As an evidence of one of those countries in violation of international law, I give you Mike Pence.
I'm Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States. And on behalf of President Donald Trump and all the American people, let me express the unwavering support of the United States as you, the people of Venezuela, raise your voices in a call for freedom. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power. We will stay with you until democracy is restored and you reclaim your birthright of libertad. Muchas gracias y vayan con Dios.
In response to this, basically thumbs up to the coup attempt, President Maduro has cut off diplomatic ties with the United States. This has caused a number of people to worry about potential armed conflict between the United States and Venezuela. And though that is obviously, as even according to the President of the United States, not off the table, the idea that there will be armed conflict between the two countries does seem fairly small. However, this assumption by Guaido is also extra legal and not something that can really be justified under any real conditions. If the president were incapacitated per the Constitution, then this would be a legal role. And I can understand being very frustrated by the fact that you are not able to win elections or feel that it is not fair, the elections that are being held. It is also ironic, though, to complain about the illegitimacy of an election you didn't participate in. If you were unable to participate in that election, which I grant you, some political parties were unable to participate in the election, and the grounds for which those parties were barred should be reviewed. And if they were unfairly barred, then they have a legitimate claim that there should be a new election. But if they have a legitimate reason to be barred, not that I'm in favor of barring political parties, if there is a asserted campaign against the president of the country, including assassination attempts, that is something that is worthwhile limiting the ability of those parties to participate in the government that they are attempting to use violence to overthrow. We have seen a number of defections of military leaders and police leaders away from the government and towards the United States and the opposition. This is potentially dangerous given the power that the military and the police forces do have in Venezuela. One of the reasons that there already has not been a successful coup in Venezuela is because the military has so far been behind Maduro. That doesn't necessarily mean it will continue that way. The thing that is really frustrating about listening to every comment about Venezuela is that so few people understand the big picture of what's gone on here. Yes, there has been mismanagement of certain things. Yes, there has been issues of corruption. But there have also been things well outside of the ability for the government to control or to predict. And to blame everything that's going on in Venezuela as a problem with the ideas of socialism, or even the ideas of Bolivarian socialism, as Hugo Chavez would call it, this is really an issue of the limits of maintaining neoliberalism. The irony of it is that Hugo Chavez fought against neoliberalism. He wanted to have Venezuela be the antithesis of the neoliberal project. The problem is that what he did was that socialism for the 21st century, as he called it, was really the social democracy of the 1950s. We didn't see the nationalization of all businesses in Venezuela, even like you did see in, say, Cuba, for the purposes of giving it back to the people of Venezuela. You did have some nationalization of some resources, mostly in the oil sector, for a legitimate purpose. Many countries in the world, the United States being the high outlier, have nationalized industries that are done for the public benefit. There's nothing socialist about that. That's a social democratic position. That is maintaining capitalist institutions throughout the government and throughout the economy, and just trying to orient some of the larger institutions towards fulfilling social good. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's something wrong or that's something bad, but it's not socialism. And it certainly has its limitations, as we've seen. Many people will say that, socialism has failed in Venezuela. Well, it's only failed because it was never actually fully implemented. And it didn't even go nearly far enough to be able to prevent exactly why those of us who are weary of reformism would see. We see the return of everything that was supposed to be overdone in the quote-unquote revolution. There has been a revolution in Venezuela, and Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro have partially led that revolution. But there are also millions and millions of Venezuelans whose lives have been completely altered by the Bolivarian missions and by the role of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. Yes, there are problems. Yes, there are things that need to be fixed. But the way to fix that is not a coup in the country that will further destabilize the political situation. It's not an ongoing economic war that disallows Venezuela from participating in the world's economy like any other country. It's about being fair and about being honest with the idea of sovereignty, and that a country can choose for itself the direction it wants to go and shouldn't have to be subject to the influence of its most powerful neighbor. The Monroe Doctrine is an old doctrine in the United States, but it's one that is so much still a part of our history and on display when you look at places like Honduras, El Salvador, even Mexico, Cuba, and certainly Venezuela. The situation in Venezuela is difficult, and there is blame to go on all sides. But the idea that this is somehow something that demands the UN Security Council discuss what we can do about it is flat out ridiculous. When you listen to the UN Security Council minutes or video of what happened just the other day, you can see the ridiculousness of the positions of many Latin American countries who are absolutely doing the bidding of the United States of America. The United States of America so ridiculously put someone who is involved in the Iran-Contra affair to make statements about democracy in Venezuela. And in Venezuela, you have an amazing representative who is able to perfectly articulate exactly what's been going on in Venezuela and exactly why it's not right. The truth is that Venezuela is failed for a lot of different reasons. And it isn't because of socialism, it isn't because of Hugo Chavez, it isn't even totally because of the United States. What it is a failure of a larger world system to be able to deal with differences in a way that doesn't threaten the stability of entire regions. The fact of the matter is that the United States' position is strong but unstable. And whenever it feels threatened by even someone who's willing to call the president a donkey, or even that he smells of sulfur at the UN, that it isn't going to destroy your country, and it isn't a threat to national security or international peace and world order. The truth is, the way the United States deals with Venezuela shows not Venezuela's weakness, but the United States.
No, this has been happening since 1999. Our late president, Comandante Chavez, was also seen as a dictator, as a socialist dictator, and the United States government was behind the coup d'etat in 2002 and all this sabotage to our oil industry. So this has been happening because we have the objective, the goal of changing the model, of building a new democratic society, which we call the socialism of this new century. And we have the right to do it. And we are an independent and sovereign country. And the thing is that here in the United States, not in the United States, I must say, not the people of the United States, but the elite that is in power, that is ruling the United States, they believe that Latin America is their backyard. And they want to impose their model, and they want to have these presidents who are also businessmen and who follow the orders of the President of the United States. But we are not So we're trying to build our own society, and in new terms, with equality, with access to health, to education, to housing, to culture, and that is our struggle. And of course, what happens is that in those terms, the U.S. elite and other countries, satellite countries of the United States, they are trying to isolate the Venezuela government. They're trying to stop this from happening, and it's not going to happen. But this is a difficult struggle, Amy, and we are really looking, and President Maduro has looked for all the paths, all the way for dialogue. We had a dialogue process last year with the opposition in Dominican Republic, hosted by the president of Dominican Republic and the former president of Spain, Rodriguez Zapatero. And when we reached the agreement, and we were there to sign the agreement, the opposition received orders from the State Department here, and they didn't sign. And then they didn't, some of their parties didn't register for the elections. And now they say that the elections were a fraud. And now they say that Maduro is not a president. That is all part of a coup d'etat in progress, encouraged and funded by the United States government.
That's it for me this week. I was out for the last 2 weeks, but I'm trying to still line up some good interviews for the next few weeks. So hopefully we'll keep our pulse on the issues, and we'll stay on top of the Venezuelan news. If you disagree with me about anything on Venezuela, let me know, and I'd love to have a discussion with somebody who has some strong feelings about it. So until then, check us out on social media, Sensible Socialist or sensiblesocialist.com.
Turn that shit off!